I thought it felt a little fast, that I came on stage a little fast. I was like, I wasn't ready for that. But did you feel that? We're talking about moving, if we're going to talk about moving to mastery, did you feel in the thing that Colin just led us, when it switched from us following to then being in our bodies, and then it took on a life of its own? You could feel it. It was about 3/4 of the way through. And that, I think, in some sense, is what it's all about, is getting to that place. And how many of you were here last night? Yeah. Okay, could you feel that too? So yeah, I remember the moment almost 20 years ago for me when I was standing outside that design lecture at Stanford's tiny little product design program, and I could feel the ping inside that design could be something bigger at Stanford, and now we stand here. My wish is that each of you can be so embodied that you can feel those pings and that you trust to follow that. And I realized not that long ago that I'm meant to be a doula for complicated births. Part of that is my own birth trauma as an identical twin, born early, 2 months early, and then being pushed out of the way, and my brother being pulled out, and then me being turned in utero, and then I got pulled out. And it wasn't until recently I realized that I was sort of holding a small space in the world because I shared a womb, and there was a lot of intervention in my birth, and I have a sense in me of what wants to come into being, like inside another person, that's whatever's special in them, what wants to come into being. Or I think the D school wanted to come into being. Like, we can take credit, but that's not where credit is. It's just I could feel that it was ready. And then I realized recently that I wanted to come into being as a young, like, premature baby, that the whatever spirit in me was meant, like, I wanted to be here. And so my invitation to all of you is, we're all doulas of this complicated birth. Whatever's wanting to be here in Africa and to come out. So my invitation is, I think, to stand in that place and invite in what wants to come into being through you and through each other and in this place. And then I think we'll find our way. I would ask everyone to close your eyes real quickly. Feel your feet on the ground. And if you're remote, I'd invite you to do the same, whether you're standing or sitting. And bring to mind, like, one of your earliest experiences in life. And make note of where you were and who you were and how young you were and what was happening. Now bring yourself to this moment and feel where you are and who you are. And think about the distance between those two places and how far you've come. And think about the people along the way that you'd want to thank, that were part of holding space for you to get here. Okay, now be here now. Okay, you can open your eyes. I'm on the verge of tears. I don't know why. When I was invited to that kind of meditation about 6 or 8 years ago by a chief financial officer of a large global bank. I was standing in Singapore, working with social entrepreneurs who were out following their heart to change the world. And I was standing in the back with other mentors and coaches, just with a friend of mine. I told this story in the master class if some of you were there. And my first moment that came to my mind was when my father took me and my twin brother to the dump to look for toys. And then I found myself standing like in a global financial epicenter, like working with entrepreneurs, and I could feel the distance between those places and how grateful I was. And when he talked about who to thank along the way, I just literally started crying. I looked over at my friend as crying. And I could feel, I knew stories of generation after generation, like we're part of a long chain and a long lineage, and that wherever I get to, my boys, I have 3 boys, can pick up, and I'll put them in a different place than maybe where I started, and they'd get to a different place, and I can see the impact of generational change. I had never felt inside my own body how far in one lifetime we can get if we really hold ourselves at that place. And last night, for me, I could feel something new was happening here, and very different than what was emerging on the West Coast in California. And I think that's what we need in this world, is what's being seeded here, the intersection of design and Africa with a K. It was said yesterday that design existed here long before others arrived in colonialization. And I think I want to sort of point us towards how do we tap that. I label the talk, or they ask months before what you're going to talk about. I'm like, I have no idea. So you try to write something down to sort of hold a container that sounds smart, and it leaves open room for you to talk about whatever needs to happen at the time. And so I don't know, I think I said something about moving to mastery. How do we move to mastery? And I hope that is a label that holds enough of a container for us to talk about. But as I was approaching this moment, none of the strategies that I've used before to prepare a talk were accessible to me. Like, no amount of thinking my way through this would help me get to this place. And I feel like I'm just being invited to tell a story that I didn't know was ready to be told. I don't know why it's supposed to be told, but I'll do that. I would just invite you into this moment. In some sense, I think it's a really, I'm living the thing that we're being asked to do. The misnomer of design thinking is it's about thinking. Thinking is one of the worst ways of thinking, as Colin invited us to. Our rational conscious mind is about the smallest horsepower we have access to. Our emotional landscape and our full somatic intelligence and our feet on the ground and the intelligence of this earth is far more capable. We just struggle to wrap our heads around it. And that's the surrender, I think, is to release ourselves from that place and trust the deeper knowing we have. So I'm being asked to stand here, I think, in that vulnerability, not knowing what I'm supposed to say. And I think that's what life invites us, is a kind of improvisation, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and we don't know what the shape of the challenges will be. We can't educate our way in anticipation of something we don't know, but we can prepare ourselves to stand in our fullness, and we can stand with each other in fullness and respond in the best way possible. That's what creativity is a kind of emergence, as we heard as well yesterday. So the story, I think, that's wanting to be told, that I don't know why. I'll just tell you how it came to me. I don't even remember when it came, but a few years ago, I just had this sense that a little children's book, and I don't know if that's the form it's supposed to be in, a children's book, but that's the first notion of it. A children's book maybe called Dahlia Rising. Dahlia. And it was a story of maybe called the Dahlia Lama. So I'm going to borrow a little bit of like the Tibetan tradition, but this is just how the story showed up. And Dahlia, as I've been walking with her the last few years, seems to be revealing a little bit more of her story bit by bit. But the way it showed up was, as the tradition goes, the Dalai Lama will eventually pass, and then there'll be a preparation, and they'll start to go out and start to look for the reemergence of that ancient soul into the next Dalai Lama. And I don't know exactly how these things go, but you can imagine them going out. Thank you for going out and searching for this. And as I understand it, they'll recognize it in a child. And whatever you believe in terms of how many laps we get on this earth, that there's this tradition that holds that there's a steward of the ancient tradition that will reemerge and will recognize it. And the story would go that they go out, and then when they find this child, it's a young girl, and not who they expect it to be. And how confronting that would be. They're like, no, something must be wrong. We're looking for the Dalai Lama. And then a little bit later, I had a dream, and she showed up, and she was more like teenager or middle age, and I was there walking alongside her, but there was like an escort of the leaders of the time, and she was walking alongside them, and it was on a coast of an ocean, like a coastline, and they were bringing her to some place of authority, and they could feel that she had authority, a kind of natural authority, and they were walking along, and I'm just there following this small cohort. And one of the leaders says, well, points to an island off the shore, and she goes, well, my house is on the other side of that island. I'm like, why is that significant? She says, well, when the storms come, my house won't be bothered. And so there was this feeling like those in authority were positioned in a way where weren't going to be impacted by the troubles that were coming. And then they escorted her into this place of authority, like almost like a temple room or a leadership hall or something, and they're all talking with their machinations and traditions and to establish their legitimacy in front of her. And she just says, stop, we don't have time for this. I can trust my own inner authority, and we have things to do. That's about as much as the story has revealed itself to me. I don't know why it's supposed to be told here, but for me, Dalai Lama and Dahlia Rising she's inviting us into our wholeness. We can't stand with just the men in the world. We have to have our full spectrum of energies, male and female. It's in all of us. And we know that in this own community and how leadership is shifting. So we have to stand in our wholeness. And the other thing I think she's teaching me is we have to move in our most natural way. To me, that's what design thinking is moving in our most natural way. Somehow, in the industrial era, we allowed ourselves to be severed from that part of us, and we moved mostly from up here. And I think that has gotten us to this place. We can solve amazing problems from up here. We can fly airplanes and talk on computers, and I can see I was messaging my 16-year-old, he texted me at like 1 in the morning because he was needing to buy a suit for a dance. So I can talk to my son on the other side of the world. So this is an amazing faculty. But sometimes it severs us from the most natural way of being, and we can feel that inside. Creativity to me emerges when we finally give ourselves, I think I mentioned on the first day, when we finally give ourselves permission to be who we are. And you guys know this, like something about growing up, we take on these other identities, the things we think we're supposed to do, the things our parents think we're supposed to do, the things that our culture tells us we're supposed to do. And at some point in your life, there's a kind of misalignment, and you can't take it anymore, and you have to shed those things that aren't you. And it's a dismantling process until finally you sort of can stand in your own essential nature. And you'll recognize that there's a tremendous dimensionality in there. Parts of yourself that you might not want to accept or didn't think that was acceptable, that welcoming that part in and standing in your wholeness. I found my judgment on others was proportional to the lack of freedom I gave myself to be who I was. And the more I gave myself freedom to be who I was, the less my judgment of others was. And so there's a kind of inner work that we're being invited into, this interior landscape, to understand this weather system that's in here. I think Colin's example of a storm, it doesn't give language, like simple language of how we're doing inside. It's not easily conceptualized. It's literally like a weather system in here. And I think we're afraid to know how to wield that. And the more we can open ourselves to that complexity, I think we'll find a kind of stillness inside. And it's from that place that creative authorship happens. Particularly in the world when there's a lot of noise, and we can feel it. There's a lot going on. And it's hard to know which way to go. When there's a lot of noise in the world, it requires a tremendous amount of inner clarity. So if you're feeling a little lost, and you're looking for signals of which way to go, it's not going to come from the outside. That's the time to quiet yourself. I'm working with someone right now, and he said at the end of a meditation, the message to him was, be still. There is so much that we need to do. And I think if we're able to, if you're feeling lost or wondering, that's the time to gather yourself back to who you are, kind of return to who you are, and stand in that fullness. My invitation is just to really bring your sense of awareness into here as you move through your day, through the rest of today, and tomorrow, and the next few months, and pay attention to when you feel out of natural alignment of who you are. And then ask, what can you let go of, or what do you need to stand in so that you can return to that place within yourself? There's something of a kind of authority, an inner authority, that can't be granted and can't be taken away when you stand in that place. And we ask about a kind of redistribution of power, and where does trust come from? The Dahlia story to me is both an invitation of hope, like wholeness and moving in our most natural way, but also kind of very disruptive act. It'll reconfigure all of our structures if we all stand in that place of inner authority. That's a type of authority that does not require the yielding of authority from another. It almost asks the opposite. It asks for everyone. If I can stand in my sovereignty, I can ask you to stand in your sovereignty. And that's the place I think design thinking is such a small word. But it was said last night that this way of moving, this most natural way of moving, which I think is more ancient than it is new, requires diversity of perspective. And that all of a sudden is another part of redistributing power. I think I'm going to pause for a moment to ask, anything from that story stirs something in you that needs to be said? Yeah. Do we have a mic? I wasn't expecting to go to the audience. Again, I'm not sure what's coming out. Yeah. What's that? Go ahead. No, it is. It's a real question. Okay. I just wasn't sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying about unlearning, because I've heard that a lot, that as we encounter design thinking, it's often a case of unlearning the way we were educated, or the way we were socialized, or the way the workplace constrained us. So I guess my question as someone who's very interested in the lifelong learning process is there a way to create a learning environment or a learning ecosystem or learning experiences, particularly focusing on young people, through to undergrad, where they don't need to do all that, and we can save them that time of taking on all the stuff that then needs to be unlearned. I guess in parallel, the question of you can't just be a design thinker. You need to take on a discipline and have a foot in a discipline. So is that just part of the territory that with that discipline we're going to take on a bunch of stuff that needs to be unlearned? I guess that's
a great question.
That's my question.
I appreciate the question. I wasn't sure a question was coming as opposed to a statement, so we'll just receive the question. You think about it. I've wondered this. Are the disciplines that we study the things that encumber us? Sometimes. Same with just growing up and the things our parents say and the families of origin. So I think the structures that we take on, that we have to ultimately recognize that we choose to say yes to, and that eventually we have to question. I think that's maybe one thing that I wish to instill into my boys. Somehow, I questioned everything about work and my professional path. And that was because my father had a creative spark inside him, was a designer, but he didn't listen to that. My perception was he didn't listen to that calling. And he chose to take the job that he felt like he could make money and take us from looking for toys at the dump to every time he got a promotion to sending 4 boys through college. Right? So there's integrity to his choices. But I think it cost him in terms of the light in his eyes. And so I think for me, seeing that, he would tell me, do what you love, do what you love, do what you love. So that was enough of a handhold for me that then when it came to work, I questioned everything about work. So then I found my own path. Like, I ended up going to college when I didn't know what it was. I found design when I didn't know what it was. I was an entrepreneur and I didn't know what it was. I found design again back at the D school and led this interesting thing at a university. Never thought I would work at a university, but it awakened that part of me because I questioned it. There were other parts of my life I didn't question, like what kind of family would work for me? What kind of partnership would work for me? Or what does it mean for me? Where do I want to live? What does home mean to me? So I think my wish is, and we can install this in our own life, but also in our kids, question everything and make it your own. I've thought about whether or not we can save the kids, that whole path of like waking up somewhere in your 40s in a house of cards that you built, wondering what are you going to do with your life, and then having to dismantle the whole thing. I don't know that question. If we look back at some of our oldest mythologies, like the archetypal wisdom, the dark night of the soul, and it seems to be in our oldest stories, which might suggest that that's part of what it means of growing up, is we're formed in a certain way, and then we have to break out of it because there's a unique expression in us that is irrepressible and needs to come out. I think the sad thing is you can live your whole life not listening to that part of you. You just probably get another chance on your next lap to do it. My wish is that we can create spaces for our kids for them to say yes to that very, very early. A lot of that to me has to do with keeping the agency in the child. And it's hard as a parent to do that because they ask a question, you want to give an answer, as opposed to they ask a question, you say, what do you think? Like, keep the agency on the child, and then flip our education system to be child-centered versus like content-centered. That might help. But it's not clear to me that we get to do that. Any other responses to the Dahlia story? Yes, Jean. Or anything else so far? And then I think we have a few minutes that I want to end with one more thing.
As you're talking, George, it really reminded me of this notion from Heidegger, which of course sounds like we're going right back to that thinking you've been telling us to avoid. Yeah. But his talk about the withheld, and this notion that inside of us is a higher, better, more authentic self that we have been trained to withhold, certainly in business organizations, right? Yeah. And for me, the pure pleasure of design thinking has been that it helps us create this space that invites the withheld. And the whole notion of Heidegger is that we can never summon the withheld.
Yes, I'm just saying.
It can only be invited, and you can only create a space in which someone makes a choice to bring that into the conversation. Yes. And I've just never seen an approach that, for me personally, working with students, has been able to create that space to invite what they withhold, for instance, in the rest of their lives as business school students, into the conversation. And I think that resonated. I
think it's beautiful language. You can feel that within yourself. When is there something stirring in you that you're choosing not to put on the table? In a conversation, a relationship, in a classroom, in a team project at work, in your home environment, and you can ask what's causing you to withhold that. Probably fear, and fear is probably the one thing that contracts us from standing in our fullness. And fear is natural. We can say, I understand why. You can talk to yourself. Oh, I acknowledge why. I hear why you're so afraid. And I think the feeling is when you release the mental clamps of wanting to know. It's a false sense of security, like our plans and our thoughts and our concepts. If you can set that aside, you find yourself standing, the language that we use, Grace and I, is like you're standing on this edge of this ever-present precipice and you don't know what's ahead. It's a daring place to stand because so much of us wants to be certain about what's coming. But that's the place, this invitation. I think as Carl Jung called it gluten mundi, that which everyone wants but no one can make happen. And you can feel it stirring. And then in that place, it's more about creating the jewel setting and allowing the jewel to come in and not trying to possess it. And I think that's what this time, we're standing in one of those moments where everyone wants to know what's next and what the path to mastery is next. Mastery doesn't have a known outcome. It's deep within, and like your creative authorship and what mastering your mastercraft would be very different than yours. If we all painted the same, we wouldn't have beautiful art. But if we can like create that space for that which is withheld, you enter that territory that is a kind of craft beyond craft, and then your great work emerges through you. And if we can hold ourselves that way, like if I can hold myself that way, which I think is the hardest thing, it's really easy to hold others that way. If we struggle to hold others that way, chances are we're not turning our greatest sense of compassion and grace towards ourselves. So I think I wanted to end with this notion of design existed in Africa long before. We talked a lot about complexity, and are the design tools preparing us to handle the complexity? And I think that's a really fair question. Particularly if we only look at design from the sense of like it's a professional craft that is started with its origins of product design, and it's having to expand to include service design, it's having to expand to include other things and eventually complex problems. And that's a fair way to think of it. It's a pretty linear way to think of it, and it's kind of design profession-centric. I think of design in a much more holistic way. And I think if we look at these social technologies, I think you used that term yesterday, and our spiritual technologies, not just our technologies, we will find that we have the tool sets and deep wisdom about handling complexity. That's what I love about Ubuntu. I first heard about Ubuntu when I was sailing on a ship. It was like a floating university. My 3 boys were there, 8, 6, and 4 years old. Archbishop was on the ship with us. My boys know him as Arch, and he used that term. I had never heard that term before. What I love about that term, and then a lot of the African proverbs that we're hearing, think about the deep cultural wisdom held in your African culture. In that simple statement holds an interdependence that no amount of simple tool sets can hold. Something about our deep cultural wisdom already knows something about handling complexity, that which we can't wrap our mind around. Like my own fullness, our interdependence, our community's fullness, our community's resilience, our relationship to the natural world, the intelligence of the natural world. My back to like design is moving in the most natural way. We need to create organizations and systems that move more like living systems than industrial ones. This wisdom is already inside of us. My hunch is if we can stand in our own fullness and then stand in the integrity of our deep cultural history and feel the truth of that, it's not about going back. It's about internalizing the truth of that deep within your soul and then re-expressing it in your own way in your current context. That's how the essence of truth transfers, not this way. It's you feel it, you hold it in you, and you live it, and then others can feel it through you. And so for me, design thinking is alive when it changes. We think quality is usually held when we can make the same thing over and over again the exact same way. And I remember the early days of the D School, some of the leaders were concerned that how do we maintain quality of design thinking as it spreads so it's taught the right way? That would reveal a rather industrial mindset of replicating things. If truth is transferred this way, as opposed to this way, then you have to expect a re-expression of it. So you know it's alive when it's different every single time. It has a different texture every single time when it goes in one person and out, in another person and out. It will have a feeling of familiarity of home, but it will be alive because it's so diverse. Okay, I think my time is up. Thank you so much. I'm so excited about the place that we're in and that something new is being planted here in Africa with a K.